You've depended on this family long enough, Margaret. Daniel is gone now, and it's time you learned how to live on your own, my daughter-in-law said while clearing the dinner plates only 3 hours after my son's funeral. I stared at her across the dining room table, certain I had misheard her at first. The house still smelled faintly like lilies from the funeral service, and Daniel's framed photograph sat beside the staircase surrounded by candles that had already begun to melt down into pools of wax. Outside, cold November rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows of the Connecticut home my husband and I had bought more than 30 years ago. The same home where Daniel took his first steps. The same home where he begged me to check under his bed for monsters when he was 6 years old. And now, somehow, it no longer felt like mine. Vanessa folded a linen napkin with slow, precise movements, avoiding my eyes entirely. She wore a cream-colored sweater and gold earrings I had never seen before, and there was something disturbingly calm about the way she spoke, as if asking me to leave after burying my son was nothing more than discussing grocery lists or weather forecasts. I'm not trying to be cruel, she added softly. But staying here clinging to memories isn't healthy. I looked toward Daniel's empty chair at the end of the table. No one had touched the slice of pecan pie I had placed there out of habit before remembering he would never sit there again. My chest tightened so sharply I had to grip the edge of the table beneath the white tablecloth just to steady myself. Across the room, the grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silence between us. Tick. 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 Every sound inside the house suddenly felt too loud now that my son's laughter was gone. Vanessa, I finally whispered, my voice barely strong enough to carry across the room, the funeral was today. She sighed heavily, like I was the difficult one. And dragging this grief out forever won't bring him back. Her words landed colder than the rain outside. For a moment, I thought about the years I spent trying to welcome her into this family. The bridal shower I hosted in our backyard. The holidays I rearranged so she could spend time with her own parents too. The way I defended her whenever Daniel complained about her spending habits or her constant need to control every detail of their lives. I had convinced myself that patience could fix distance. That kindness could soften coldness. I see now how foolish that was. Vanessa picked up her wine glass and carried it to the sink without another glance in my direction. I already called a senior apartment complex in Hartford, she said casually over her shoulder. They have openings next month. I felt something inside me go completely still then. Not shattered. Not broken. Just still. Like a lake freezing over after the first hard winter frost. Because in that moment, I realized this conversation had not started tonight. Vanessa had been planning this for much longer than I ever imagined. I slowly stood from the table, smoothing the wrinkles from my black dress with trembling fingers. Upstairs, Daniel's childhood bedroom door remained slightly open, just the way he used to leave it as a teenager. I looked at it for several seconds before turning back toward my daughter-in-law. She finally met my eyes then, and for the first time since the funeral began, I saw no sadness in her expression at all. Only relief. I gave her a small nod, the kind polite women give strangers in grocery stores. Then I quietly said, "You should get some rest, Vanessa." She looked almost surprised by how calm I sounded. But I had already begun to understand something she didn't. Grief changes people. Sometimes it destroys them. And sometimes it opens their eyes. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice somewhere inside the house, calling out for coffee before work or laughing at one of those terrible game shows he used to watch late at night. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to rest and walked downstairs wrapped in the old gray cardigan my husband bought me years ago during a winter trip to Vermont. The house was dark except for the small kitchen light above the stove. Rain still fell steadily outside, tracing thin silver lines down the windows. I stood there for a long moment listening to the silence. No footsteps upstairs. No television humming in the den. No sound except the refrigerator motor and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Grief changes the sound of a home. It stretches every silence until it feels endless. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat alone at the kitchen table where Daniel used to spread out his homework after school. My fingers rested against the warm mug while my eyes wandered around the room. That was when I noticed something strange. The framed family photo that normally sat beside the fruit bowl was gone. It had been there yesterday morning before the funeral. I stood slowly and checked the counters. Then the living room shelves. Nothing. Every photograph that included me had disappeared overnight. My stomach tightened. I walked carefully into the hallway and stopped outside Daniel's office. The door was shut completely now. Yesterday afternoon it had been slightly open. I reached for the brass handle and turned it gently. Locked. I stared at the door for several seconds, confused at first, then uneasy. Daniel never locked that room. Not once in all the years he lived here. I heard footsteps upstairs then. Vanessa appeared at the top of the staircase wearing silk pajamas and holding her phone in one hand. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, and despite burying her husband less than 12 hours earlier, she looked strangely refreshed. "You are up early," she said calmly. "I could not sleep," I answered. My voice sounded tired even to me. Her eyes drifted toward the office door before quickly returning to me. "I had the locks changed yesterday," she said casually. "There are important financial documents inside, and I do not want anything misplaced during all this chaos." Chaos. That was the word she chose for her husband's death. I nodded slowly even though something about her explanation felt rehearsed. Vanessa walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, scanning the shelves like nothing unusual had happened. "I also called a realtor this morning," she added without looking at me. "The market is strong right now. It would be smart to move quickly." I stared at her in disbelief. "You are selling the house?" She closed the refrigerator door softly. "Eventually. It is too large for just one person." One person. As if I had already vanished from the home. I lowered my eyes to the tea trembling slightly in my hands. That was when I noticed Daniel's coffee mug sitting beside the sink. White ceramic with tiny blue stripes around the rim. A crack near the handle from when he dropped it years ago rushing out the door for work. Vanessa followed my gaze. Without hesitation, she picked up the mug and dropped it into a black trash bag beside the counter. The sound shattered something deep inside my chest. "Vanessa," I whispered. That was Daniel's favorite mug. She tied the trash bag closed with a quick shrug. "It is just clutter, Margaret. Holding on to every little thing is unhealthy." I looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time since the funeral. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Vanessa was not grieving. She was reorganizing. The next afternoon, the house no longer looked like a place where a family had gathered to mourn. It looked staged. Controlled. Sanitized in a way that made my skin crawl. The sympathy flowers were gone from the foyer when I came downstairs after showering. So were the framed funeral programs I had carefully stacked beside the fireplace that morning. Vanessa stood in the living room directing two young men from a donation company as they carried boxes toward the front door. "Be careful with those," she said sharply. "Most of it is old and fragile anyway." I stopped halfway down the staircase, gripping the wooden railing tightly. One of the boxes had Daniel's name written across the side in black marker. Inside were his college yearbooks, old baseball trophies, and the navy blue blanket his grandmother knitted for him when he was 12. "What is happening?" I asked quietly. Vanessa glanced up at me without surprise, as though she had expected me to appear eventually. "I am decluttering," she replied. "This house has been overflowing with unnecessary things for years." One of the movers carried out a cardboard box filled with framed family photographs. I immediately recognized the silver frame from our beach trip to Cape Cod 10 summers ago. Daniel had his arm around my shoulders in that picture, both of us laughing while the wind blew our hair across our faces. I stepped forward instinctively. "Please leave those here," I said. The young mover hesitated and looked toward Vanessa for direction. She smiled politely, but there was steel underneath it now. "Margaret, you cannot keep turning this house into a shrine." Shrine. Another ugly word spoken too casually. I folded my arms tightly against the chill spreading through my chest. Daniel died 4 days ago. Vanessa exhaled slowly, like she was exhausted by my inability to cooperate. Exactly. And someone has to think clearly right now. She turned back toward the movers. "Everything in the hallway closet can go too." I watched silently as they carried away pieces of my son's life while his coat still hung beside the front door. The same gray wool coat he wore every winter since moving back home after his divorce scare 2 years ago. My eyes lingered on it for several seconds before I realized something else felt wrong. The hallway table drawer was slightly open. Daniel always kept it closed because the wood jammed against the frame. Slowly, I walked over and pulled it open wider. Empty. Completely empty. My stomach tightened immediately. That drawer used to hold spare keys, unopened mail, and Daniel's leather notebook where he wrote reminders and account information. It was gone. "Looking for something?" Vanessa asked from behind me. Her tone sounded pleasant, but too careful. I closed the drawer slowly. Daniel kept important papers here. I moved everything upstairs into the office. She crossed the room and straightened a decorative candle on the shelf even though it was already perfectly aligned. "It is safer that way." Safer for who, I wondered. Just then, Vanessa's phone rang. She glanced at the screen quickly before stepping toward the kitchen. "I need to take this," she said. I remained near the hallway while her voice lowered into a near whisper around the corner. "Yes," she murmured. "She still thinks she has time." A long pause followed. "No, not yet. Probate should be finalized within a few weeks if everything goes smoothly." My breath caught painfully in my throat. Probate. Everything suddenly felt colder. More deliberate. I stood perfectly still, listening carefully while rain tapped against the windows again outside. "Once the house sells, none of this will matter anyway," Vanessa continued softly. "She will be moved out before Christmas." I felt the blood drain from my face. Christmas. Daniel loved Christmas more than anyone I knew. Every year he covered the front porch with white lights before Thanksgiving even ended. Last December we spent an entire afternoon baking cinnamon cookies while old Frank Sinatra songs played through the kitchen speakers. And now his widow was discussing my removal from the house like rescheduling furniture delivery. I slowly stepped away from the hallway before the floorboards could creak beneath my feet. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door carefully behind me and sat down on the edge of the bed. For several minutes, I simply stared at Daniel's old baseball glove resting on the bookshelf across the room. Then, with trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had not called in almost 3 years. Eleanor Hayes answered on the second ring. Eleanor arrived just after 7 that evening carrying a navy umbrella dripping rainwater across the front porch. The moment I opened the door, I felt something inside me loosen slightly for the first time since Daniel died. She had been my closest friend for nearly 40 years, back from when our sons played Little League together in Hartford. Eleanor had eventually become one of the most respected real estate attorneys in Connecticut before retiring 2 years ago, but to me she was still the woman who once sat beside my hospital bed all night after my husband's heart surgery, drinking terrible vending machine coffee and refusing to leave me alone. She stepped inside quietly, removing her gloves with slow careful movements. "Margaret," she whispered, and before I realized it, her arms were around me. The warmth of another human being nearly broke me apart right there in the foyer. I had spent days surrounded by people, offering sympathy cards and casseroles while somehow feeling completely abandoned. But Eleanor's embrace felt real. Steady. Safe. Vanessa appeared briefly at the top of the staircase when she heard voices. Her expression tightened the instant she saw who had arrived. I did not realize we were having visitors, she said coolly. Eleanor glanced upward with the same calm confidence she used to carry inside courtrooms. Good evening, Vanessa. The two women exchanged polite smiles sharp enough to cut glass. We will not be long, Eleanor added. Vanessa folded her arms lightly against the staircase railing. Try not to upset Margaret too much. Stress is hard on older people. Then she disappeared upstairs before either of us could answer. Eleanor waited until we heard the bedroom door close overhead before turning slowly toward me. Something is wrong in this house, she said quietly. Not a question. A fact. I nodded once and led her into the kitchen where the scent of lemon furniture polish still lingered from Vanessa cleaning all afternoon. The dining table looked strangely bare now without the family photographs and flowers. Even Daniel's favorite chair had been moved into storage earlier that morning. Eleanor noticed everything immediately. Lawyers always do. Tell me everything from the beginning, she said. So I did. I told her about the locked office door. The missing documents. The realtor calls. The donation boxes. Vanessa speaking about probate while my son had barely been buried. Eleanor listened without interrupting once, her fingers resting lightly around a cup of untouched coffee. The deeper into the story I went, the more serious her expression became. When I finally finished, silence settled heavily between us. Rain tapped softly against the windows again. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear drawers opening and closing inside Daniel's bedroom. Eleanor lowered her voice. Margaret, did Daniel ever mention updating legal paperwork recently? I frowned slightly. A few months ago he asked strange questions about trusts and property transfers after dinner one night. I assumed it was related to work. Eleanor nodded slowly like she had expected that answer. Then she reached into her leather purse and removed a sealed ivory envelope with Daniel's handwriting across the front. My breath caught instantly. I would have recognized my son's handwriting anywhere. Strong neat letters slightly tilted to the right just like his father's. Eleanor placed the envelope carefully onto the kitchen table between us. Daniel came to see me 3 months ago, she said softly. The room suddenly felt colder around me. He asked me to hold on to this unless something happened to him. My fingers trembled as I stared at the envelope. What is it? Eleanor's eyes lifted toward the ceiling briefly where Vanessa moved around overhead. He did not tell me everything, she admitted. But he was worried, Margaret. Deeply worried. My heart began pounding painfully against my ribs. About what? Eleanor hesitated for the first time all evening. Then she looked directly into my eyes. About Vanessa. I could barely breathe as I stared at the envelope resting between us on the kitchen table. Daniel's handwriting looked so alive that for one impossible second I expected him to walk through the front door carrying grocery bags and apologizing for being late. My fingertips hovered over the paper without touching it. Eleanor watched me carefully across the table. You do not have to open it tonight, she said gently. But I already knew I would never sleep again if I did not. Slowly, I slid one trembling finger beneath the sealed flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver flash drive attached to a key ring. My chest tightened immediately at the sight of it. Daniel always carried that same key ring in his jacket pocket. I unfolded the letter carefully while Eleanor remained silent beside me. The first line alone nearly shattered me. Mom, if you are reading this, something has gone very wrong. Tears blurred my vision instantly. I pressed one hand against my mouth and forced myself to continue reading. Daniel's words felt steady and calm, exactly the way he used to speak whenever I became anxious about anything. He wrote that over the past year he had discovered financial activity connected to Vanessa that he could not explain. Secret accounts. Missing money. Credit lines opened without discussion. At first he convinced himself it was misunderstanding or stress, but the deeper he looked, the more frightened he became. My eyes moved shakily across every line. Daniel explained that Vanessa had pressured him repeatedly to transfer ownership of the house entirely into her name after my husband died. According to him, their arguments about money had become constant during the months before his accident. One sentence made my stomach drop completely. If anything happens to me unexpectedly, do not trust Vanessa with the house or my accounts until Eleanor reviews everything personally. I lowered the letter slowly into my lap while rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa moving furniture across the hardwood floor. The sound suddenly felt unbearable. Eleanor reached toward the flash drive carefully. "There is more," she said quietly. My throat tightened painfully. She carried her laptop everywhere even in retirement, and within minutes the screen glowed softly against the dim kitchen light. Eleanor inserted the drive and opened a single video file dated 3 weeks earlier. Daniel appeared on the screen sitting inside his office upstairs. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. His wedding ring missing. My heart ached at the sight of him. "Mom," he began quietly, rubbing one hand across his face, "if you are watching this, then Eleanor was right and I ran out of time." I felt my breath catch. Daniel looked directly into the camera now, his expression heavy with regret. "I should have protected you sooner." Tears slid silently down my cheeks as his voice filled the quiet kitchen. He explained that Vanessa had become obsessed with selling the property ever since developers started buying land in our neighborhood the previous year. The house sat on nearly 3 acres overlooking a protected lakefront area outside Hartford, and several companies had approached Daniel privately offering enormous amounts of money. But Daniel refused every offer because my husband built that home himself room by room over decades. Dad wanted Mom to stay there. As long as she lived, he said firmly in the video. Vanessa never accepted that. Eleanor paused the screen briefly and looked toward me carefully. "Margaret," she said softly, "there is something else you need to understand." My fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen table. "What?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. 3 months ago Daniel transferred the house and most of his assets into a protected trust. I stared at her in shock. "What does that mean?" Her eyes remained steady on mine. "It means Vanessa may believe she owns this house." A long silence filled the kitchen. Then Eleanor spoke the words that changed everything. "But legally, she does not own any of it." For a long moment, I could not speak. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for the weight of everything I had just learned. My eyes drifted toward the dark hallway leading to Daniel's office upstairs, and for the first time since his funeral, I no longer felt helpless inside my own home. Beneath the grief, something steadier had begun to form. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Eleanor closed the laptop carefully while thunder rumbled softly somewhere beyond the lake outside. "Vanessa does not know any of this yet?" I asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head once. Daniel was very specific. Nothing was to be revealed unless it became absolutely necessary. I lowered my eyes toward the letter still resting in my lap. Daniel's handwriting blurred again through tears. Even now, after everything, my son had still been trying to protect me. Upstairs, I heard footsteps crossing the hallway overhead. Vanessa was moving quickly now, opening drawers and shutting cabinet doors. It sounded less like grieving and more like inventory. Eleanor leaned closer across the table. "Margaret, you need to be careful until we understand exactly how much Vanessa knows." I nodded slowly. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving the house wrapped in an eerie silence broken only by distant wind moving through the trees near the water. "What should I do?" I whispered. Eleanor's answer came immediately. "Nothing." I looked up at her in confusion. "Nothing?" "Let her believe she is winning." Her voice remained Calm and precise, the same tone she used to use in courtrooms before dismantling someone's entire case. People reveal themselves fully when they think nobody can stop them. The words settled deeply inside me because I already knew she was right. Vanessa had spent days pretending to be patient and practical while quietly erasing my son from this house piece by piece. If she believed the property already belonged to her, she would become careless eventually. Eleanor gathered the envelope and flash drive carefully back into her purse before standing near the kitchen sink. "I will begin reviewing the trust paperwork tomorrow morning," she said. "But until then, you say nothing." Upstairs, a floorboard creaked again. Then silence. Vanessa was probably listening. The thought no longer frightened me the way it would have a week ago. Eleanor squeezed my hand gently before leaving through the side entrance to avoid another confrontation. "Call me immediately if anything changes," she said quietly. I promised I would. After she left, the house felt colder than before. I stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes staring at the dark reflection of myself in the window above the sink. 71 years old. Widow. Mother. And somehow still standing after burying the only child I ever had. Eventually, I climbed the staircase slowly toward my bedroom. Halfway down the upstairs hallway, I noticed light spilling from beneath Daniel's office door. My pulse quickened instantly. The lock had not stopped Vanessa from going inside herself. I moved quietly toward the doorway and heard her voice through the crack. "No, I have not found it yet," she whispered sharply into her phone. A long pause followed. He must have hidden the final paperwork somewhere else. I stopped breathing completely. Hidden paperwork. She knew there was more. "I do not care what the attorney said," Vanessa continued quietly. "Once the house is listed, none of this will matter." Another pause. Then softer now, almost impatient. "Margaret suspects nothing. She is too emotional to understand any of it." I closed my eyes briefly as pain spread through my chest again. Not because of the insult. Because Daniel had been right. Every warning he left behind had been true. I stepped backward silently before the old hallway floorboards could betray me and returned to my room without making a sound. Once the bedroom door closed behind me, I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and stared at the moonlight reflecting faintly across the carpet. Vanessa believed grief had made me weak. That losing my son had broken me into someone easier to remove. But grief had done something else entirely. It had finally taught me who I was living with. The following morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds for the first time since Daniel's funeral, but the warmth never seemed to reach inside the house. I woke early after barely sleeping and sat quietly beside my bedroom window watching pale light spread across the frozen lake behind the property. Everything outside looked peaceful. Still. Normal. Inside the house, it felt like strangers were slowly dismantling my entire life one room at a time. Downstairs, I found Vanessa standing in the kitchen speaking cheerfully with someone on speakerphone while sipping coffee from one of my husband's old ceramic mugs. She ended the call the moment she noticed me enter the room. "Good morning," she said brightly, almost too brightly. "I was just speaking with a realtor about staging ideas." I nodded calmly and reached for the kettle without answering. Vanessa leaned casually against the counter, studying me carefully. "I have been thinking," she continued, "it might be best if you start looking at assisted living communities sooner rather than later. The good places fill up quickly around the holidays." Her voice sounded smooth and caring on the surface, but underneath it I could hear impatience now. The kind people use when they are tired of waiting for an inconvenience to disappear. I poured hot water slowly into a teacup while keeping my hand steady. "That is thoughtful of you," I replied softly. Vanessa blinked once, clearly surprised by how agreeable I sounded. "Well," she said carefully, "I know this adjustment cannot be easy." Adjustment. As though my son's death and my removal from his home were simply part of some natural transition. I stirred honey into my tea while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Actually, I said after a long pause, you may be right. Vanessa straightened slightly. About what? I lifted my eyes toward her calmly for the first time in days. About me leaving. Silence filled the kitchen instantly. For a brief second, I saw something flicker across her face. Relief. Real relief. She recovered quickly, lowering her eyes with practiced sympathy. I think it would be healthier for everyone. Everyone. Meaning herself. I carried my tea toward the dining room window and stood quietly overlooking the backyard where Daniel used to shovel snow into giant piles every winter for neighborhood children to climb on. Vanessa followed behind me cautiously now, as though worried I might suddenly change my mind. I could help you pack this weekend, she offered. There is a lovely senior community about 20 minutes from Hartford with lake views. I almost smiled at the performance of it all. For days earlier she could barely tolerate my grief. Now she spoke with the careful patience of a social worker relocating an elderly patient. That sounds nice, I answered quietly. Behind me, I heard her exhale softly in satisfaction. The rest of the morning passed strangely peacefully after that. Vanessa hummed while organizing kitchen drawers. She ordered expensive takeout for lunch instead of cooking. At one point, I even caught her smiling to herself while scrolling through furniture listings online. She believed the difficult part was over now. She believed I had surrendered. By late afternoon, she left the house to meet someone in town, and the moment her car disappeared down the driveway, I walked quickly upstairs toward Daniel's office. The new lock still gleamed silver against the dark wood door. My heart pounded as I removed a small brass key from my cardigan pocket. Eleanor had given it to me an hour earlier after calling to say she found a duplicate among Daniel's trust documents. He probably kept it hidden in case Vanessa changed the locks, she had explained. My fingers trembled slightly as I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open immediately. The office smelled faintly like cedarwood and Daniel's cologne. For one painful second, I simply stood there staring at the room untouched by time. His leather chair pushed halfway beneath the desk. His reading glasses beside the computer monitor. A half-finished crossword puzzle still sitting near the lamp. It felt as though my son had only stepped away for a moment. Then my eyes landed on the open desk drawers. Papers scattered everywhere. File folders overturned. Vanessa had already been searching through everything. Slowly, I walked toward the bookshelf near the window where Daniel kept old baseball memorabilia and framed family photographs. That was when I noticed something unusual. One frame sat slightly crooked compared to the others. I reached for it carefully and froze the moment I lifted it. Taped behind the photograph was another envelope with my name written across the front. My hands trembled as I carefully peeled the envelope away from the back of the picture frame. The photograph itself was from Daniel's 35th birthday dinner 3 years earlier. He stood between Vanessa and me smiling with one arm around each of us while snow fell softly outside the restaurant windows behind us. Looking at it now felt almost unreal, like staring into someone else's life. I turned the envelope over slowly. My name was written across the front in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Mom. Just that one word. Simple. Careful. Loving. I sat down heavily in Daniel's leather desk chair before opening it. Inside was another handwritten letter along with a folded legal document stamped with Eleanor's law office seal. My chest tightened immediately. Daniel's letter was shorter this time. Mom, if you found this, then Vanessa has already started searching the office. Please trust Eleanor completely. I know this will hurt you, but there are things about my marriage I hid because I thought I could fix them myself. I should not have left you unprotected. I pressed my hand against my mouth as tears blurred the page again. Daniel explained that during the last year of his marriage, Vanessa secretly contacted multiple developers behind his back trying to negotiate future property deals connected to the house. She had even attempted to pressure him into moving me into assisted living months before his death by claiming I was becoming forgetful and emotionally unstable. One sentence made my stomach drop completely. She told people you would not understand the paperwork if ownership changed. I stared at the words for several seconds, unable to breathe properly. Forgetful. Unstable. While I spent years defending Vanessa to friends who warned me she seemed cold and manipulative, she had quietly been preparing to erase me entirely. Beneath the letter sat the legal document. I unfolded it carefully across Daniel's desk. The language was formal and dense, but one sentence stood out immediately. The Whitmore Lake Property Trust shall remain under the sole lifetime residential authority of Margaret Whitmore. I blinked slowly in disbelief. Daniel had legally protected my right to remain in the house for the rest of my life. The property itself could not be sold without conditions that Vanessa clearly knew nothing about. My eyes moved farther down the page. In the event of any attempt to remove Margaret Whitmore from the residence through coercion, intimidation, or misrepresentation, all beneficiary privileges shall immediately transfer to secondary charitable trustees. I sat frozen in silence. Vanessa had spent days trying to force me out while unknowingly triggering the exact protections Daniel had built against her. Downstairs, I suddenly heard the sound of the front door opening. My pulse jumped instantly. Vanessa was home earlier than expected. I quickly slid the documents back into the envelope just as her voice echoed faintly through the hallway below. "Margaret," she called out brightly. "I brought dinner." Her tone sounded cheerful now. Almost celebratory. I quietly locked the office door again before slipping the envelope beneath my cardigan and walking downstairs slowly with steady steps. The smell of expensive Italian takeout filled the kitchen. Vanessa stood arranging containers across the counter while soft jazz music played from the speaker near the refrigerator. Candles burned beside the sink. She looked almost radiant. "I thought we both deserved a peaceful evening," she said warmly. Peaceful. The word nearly made me laugh. I studied her carefully as she poured red wine into 2 crystal glasses. She truly believed everything was falling into place now. "I also have exciting news," she added casually while handing me a plate. "The realtor found potential buyers already." I lowered myself quietly into a chair at the dining table. "That was fast." Vanessa smiled proudly. "Properties near the lake are in high demand." Her eyes drifted toward the hallway where family photographs once hung before she removed them all. "It is time for fresh beginnings." Fresh beginnings. As though my son's entire life could simply be swept aside like old furniture. She raised her wine glass toward me gently. "To moving forward," she said. I looked into her eyes for a long moment before lifting my glass too. "To truth," I answered softly. For the first time since Daniel died, I noticed uncertainty flicker briefly across Vanessa's face. 2 days later, Vanessa hosted what she called a small dinner gathering to celebrate new beginnings. That was the exact phrase printed across the gold-lettered invitation card sitting near the front entrance beside fresh white roses. I stared at those words for several seconds before quietly hanging my coat in the hallway closet. The house looked almost unrecognizable now. Vanessa had removed nearly every trace of Daniel from the downstairs rooms. His photographs were gone. His favorite records had disappeared from the shelves. Even the old knitted blanket he used during winter football games no longer rested on the living room sofa. In their place stood expensive candles, modern decorations, and glossy real estate brochures neatly arranged across the coffee table. The transformation felt cold. Careful. Like someone preparing a staged model home instead of mourning a husband. Voices drifted through the dining room where several guests already laughed softly over wine glasses and catered appetizers. A realtor from Hartford stood near the fireplace speaking with a couple dressed in expensive wool coats while Vanessa smiled beside them with polished confidence. "The lake views alone make this property exceptional," she was saying. "And the renovations will completely modernize the space." Renovations. The word hit me harder than I expected. This house was never meant to be modernized. My husband built the bookshelves in the den by hand. Daniel carved our family initials into the dock beside the lake when he was 16. Every corner of this home carried fingerprints of the people who loved it long before Vanessa arrived. She noticed me standing quietly near the doorway and immediately crossed the room holding a glass of champagne. "Margaret," she said brightly, "you made it downstairs. I was worried you might not feel up to socializing." Her voice sounded sweet enough to fool strangers. I accepted the champagne flute without drinking from it. I would not miss this. Something in my tone made her pause briefly before her smile returned. "Everyone has been so supportive during this transition," she continued smoothly. "I know Daniel would want us to move forward positively." Move forward. Another carefully chosen phrase. As though grief itself had become inconvenient. Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang sharply through the house. Vanessa glanced toward the foyer, slightly annoyed. "That should be the final couple from Westport," she murmured before walking gracefully toward the entrance. I remained near the dining room while conversation continued around me. Outside the windows, snow had begun falling softly across the dark lake. The sight instantly reminded me of Christmas Eve 3 years earlier when Daniel stayed outside for nearly an hour hanging lights across the dock because he knew how much I loved seeing them reflect on the water. My chest tightened painfully at the memory. Then silence suddenly spread through the foyer. The kind of silence that changes the air inside a room. Conversations behind me faded one by one. I slowly turned toward the front entrance just as Vanessa's voice broke sharply across the house. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor stepped calmly into the foyer carrying a leather briefcase beneath her coat. Beside her stood a tall man in a charcoal overcoat holding several legal folders against his chest. I recognized him immediately from Daniel's memorial service. Attorney Michael Reeves. Vanessa's expression had gone completely pale. "This is a private gathering," she said quickly. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly without looking intimidated in the slightest. "Actually," she replied calmly, "this property meeting concerns legal ownership, so our presence is entirely appropriate." Every guest in the room had gone silent now. The realtor near the fireplace lowered her wine glass carefully while exchanging nervous glances with the potential buyers. Vanessa laughed suddenly, but the sound came out strained and brittle. "I think there has been some misunderstanding." Michael Reeves opened one of the folders slowly. "There is no misunderstanding, Mrs. Whitmore." He looked directly at her. "The property cannot legally be sold." The room froze completely. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me." Eleanor stepped forward then, her calm voice carrying through the silence. 3 months before his death, Daniel Whitmore transferred the property and major assets into an irrevocable protected trust. Vanessa's face drained of color entirely now. "No," she whispered instantly. "That is impossible." Michael Reeves removed several signed documents from the folder. "Under the terms of the trust, Margaret Whitmore retains permanent lifetime residential authority over this home." I watched Vanessa's eyes dart wildly across the pages as realization finally began crashing down around her. Furthermore, Eleanor continued quietly, "Any attempt to remove Margaret through coercion or manipulation immediately voids beneficiary control." One of the guests near the fireplace slowly stepped backward in discomfort. The realtor quietly closed her folder. Vanessa looked at me then for the first time without confidence. Without control. "Margaret," she said weakly, "you knew." I held her gaze calmly across the room filled with strangers standing awkwardly among half-finished wine glasses and untouched appetizers. Then I answered with the truth that had lived quietly inside me ever since opening Daniel's final letter. "My son knew exactly who you were."